Everywhere I look, I see people losing their minds over the impact of boosting on the Mythic Plus reward thresholds. If you believe the online discourse, paid and plus boosts are ruining the competitive integrity of the game mode. They're pushing up the score cutoffs and they're locking legitimate players out of high level rewards. But this left me wondering, how much of an impact is boosting actually having? To find out, I took 3 different approaches to estimate how common boosting is around both the top 1% and 0.1% reward thresholds, and more importantly, how much those boosted characters are actually moving each cutoff. To start out, I wanted to at least get some sort of a rough estimate for how many potentially boosted players might exist within the top 1% cutoff in North America. Raider.io publishes a lot of its Mythic Plus data, so I used AI to dig through it and look for patterns that could be reasonably associated with boosting. This obviously wasn't going to tell me who actually bought boosts, but there were things that I could see fairly easily within the data that Raider.io publicly publishes. This mainly included how quickly characters gain score and how many high-level Mythic Plus runs they'd actually done. So for the first one, rapid score progression, across the roughly 11,700 characters inside the current top 1% bracket, only 104 had gained more than 400 rating between 2 Raider.io snapshots taken roughly a week apart. Now, obviously, this only accounts for really large score jumps within this given week. So if we assumed that, say, 3 separate groups of 104 players are making the same massive jump across 3 consecutive weeks, this would leave us with roughly 312 characters within the cutoff band who had made this sort of rapid progression. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're boosted. I did actually manually check a lot of the examples, and there were quite a few that were very clearly just experienced players who were either climbing on alts or pushing very late in the season, but it does give us a bit of an upper boundary. The second metric I then analysed was how many high-level Mythic Plus runs these characters had played. The median inside the top 1% was 71 timed keys at a plus 15 or higher. This was the bracket that I could actually see publicly. But at the very bottom of this, there were 500 characters that had done fewer than 20 timed plus 15s for the entire season. Again, this doesn't necessarily mean that all of these players were boosted. Some of them were going to be alts or raiders or PvPers or just really good players starting late in the season. But it is a good indication because generally speaking, boost recipients are only going to have timed a handful of keys at a higher level. For the sake of creating an intentionally ridiculous upper estimate, I basically just added both of these together. So I took the 312 rapidly progressing characters over the last 3 weeks and then added every single character that had done less than 20 runs above a plus 15. This gives us 800 potentially boosted characters, or roughly 7% of the entire 1% bracket. This is a huge overestimate though. In this, we're going to be double counting people, we're going to be treating alts as buyers, we're going to be treating experienced players as buyers. But if we take this as just an extreme upper end and just delete all of those 800 characters from the leaderboard, the 1% cutoff falls by roughly 15 rating. And I think this was the point that I was sort of trying to look for. How much is boosting actually keeping people out of the bracket? Now, if you finish 2 or 3 points below cutoff, then yeah, boosting has probably made a difference between you getting a reward and missing it. Even 5 or 10 points could matter depending where everything settles. But if you're 20 or 30 or 40 points below the line, even using a model which assumes that every suspicious character is boosted doesn't make a difference. You still would have been outside the bracket. The problem with this, though, I found is that the entire analysis was pretty speculative. Rapid progression and not many high-level keys are indications of people being boosted, but it's not a complete conclusion. What I actually needed to do was look at every single individual run specifically. Unfortunately, this is also something that I couldn't automate just because of what Raider.io actually publishes to be publicly scraped, as well as just by the sheer numbers involved. So I was going to have to check manually. To have an even semi-realistic chance of doing this manually, I decided to focus specifically on the 0.1% bracket, mainly to preserve my sanity. Otherwise, I was going to have to manually review like over 10,000 runs, which just didn't feel practical at all. Being able to manually review every character in the 0.1% title range, though, was really useful because it did allow me to notice patterns that I otherwise wouldn't be able to scrape with AI. Firstly, a number of boosting teams appeared. These were super recognizable as well. It would often be 4 of the same characters with a much higher IO, and then the boost recipient as part of the group. Many of these characters are also advertising on their Raider IO bios as well, so it was pretty clear what was going on. When I went through this analysis, any person that I found running with these squads, I immediately marked as boosted. On that note, a few of the teams and some of the boost recipients also had their profiles set to private. While having a private profile on Raider IO isn't an immediate indictment, it is often a sign that the player is boosted. So from that point onwards, anyone with an anonymous character, I immediately labeled as boosted as well. There were some really obvious ones throughout this whole thing. These were characters that often had less than 15 timed runs above a +20, and they almost always just had 1 key of each of the levels timed with the same boosting core. These were the very clear out and out buyers. But there were also some less obvious ones that I would not have noticed using just like scraping tools from before. A lot of buyers had actually played the entire season all the way up until they hit a wall around the +23 range, before then employing one of the boosting groups to knock out the final key levels. This is why I think the manual review was really useful. I actually looked at the top keys for every single player within the bracket, aside from those above like the top 400, because most of the time, no boosts are going on there. They are the boosters rather than the boosties. It's also worth noting that boosts dropped off significantly around the 42.25 mark. This is sort of a meaningful spot as well, because I think this is the clearly safe spot for title. There were a couple of players who had bought Resil 23s, but this was pretty rare. So for the most part, the boosting was occurring between the 42.12 and 42.25 bracket. When you're digging through the profiles as well, it's really easy to find legitimate players. They basically had always done multiple runs at a +22 and then often multiple +23s of the same key. There was roughly a 50-50 split between static groups that people had run with and then just players jumping between different groups as well. This is all well and good though, but how many did we identify total? Overall, 78 characters of the roughly 1,200 in title cutoff in North America, I noticed as boosted. Interestingly enough, this is actually close to the percentage found in the broad scrape using AI earlier, although I do think that this is purely by chance. Now for the interesting part though, how much does the cutoff change when we remove all of these boosted characters? Between 4 and 5 points. If all characters who were boosted were removed from the leaderboard right now, even ones that may not have been boosted, maybe some of these players were just friends with the guys that they were running with, the cutoff in North America would only drop by 4 to 5 points. Now, after spending way too much time reading discourse around the 1% and 0.1% cutoffs, I have become increasingly annoyed at the constant, it's meaningless, there's no integrity, there's so much boosting comments that just seem to appear everywhere. Don't get me wrong, boosting is clearly happening, like we found that in the data. And when I did dig through the title leaderboards, there were really obvious examples, but the actual impact on the cutoff score is tiny. Even if we use our incredibly loose and deliberately exaggerated estimate of top 1% boosting, it only accounts for like a 15-point increase in the North America cutoff for the 1% mount. That's barely a single key level in one of the 8 dungeons. At title range, where we could actually identify the boost recipients manually with much more accuracy, removing every single one of them moved the cutoff by about 4 or 5 points. That is less than half a key level. We're talking like crumbs in 2 dungeons. Now, if you were to miss one of these rewards by a hair, that would absolutely suck. Like if you finish 3 points below title and there are dozens of people above you who are quite obviously bought those keys, I'd be pretty pissed off too. In that very narrow situation, boosting genuinely can be the difference between getting a reward and missing a reward. But that describes such a tiny sliver of the player base that sit directly on that boundary. It does not explain why someone who is 20 or 30 or 40 points behind cutoff didn't get the reward. This is probably the biggest thing I took away from all of this. The cutoff isn't rocketing up at the end of the season because hordes of boosted players are flooding into the bracket. The overwhelming majority of the movement is completely organic. Boosting contributes to the movement to some degree, but on the scale of the overall ladder, its contribution is very small. I'm not really here to make some sort of moral argument about boosting or anything. I honestly don't have strong feelings about it one way or another. You can argue that someone being able to buy prestigious awards cheapens that reward, and I think that's pretty reasonable as well. But that is different from claiming that boosting is completely ruining the competition itself, or that boosters are massively inflating the score that you need to earn these rewards. Based on the statistics of what's actually happening, that isn't true. And this is where I'm going to be like a little bit candid. I think boosting has become a really convenient scapegoat for people. Percentile-based competition is brutal because someone is always going to miss out and finish just outside that bracket. But that's the entire point. The goalposts keep moving because you're competing against other people. And the fact that these rewards are genuinely difficult to earn is exactly what makes them fun and interesting to go for in the first place. If boosting was to disappear tomorrow, the vast majority of people currently complaining about the cutoff and boosting in general would still not get those rewards. So basically, boosting exists, and people who narrowly miss rewards by a couple of points have every right to be frustrated about it. But boosting is not the big bad boogeyman that everyone seems to think that it is. Unless you are sitting within like less than a key level of a reward, and most of the time it will be much, much less, boosting is not changing the outcome for you at all. You would have missed that reward anyway. A massive thanks to my YouTube and Buy Me a Coffee supporters. The Joy of Checks, Tobias, Yulem, Is This Real, Obold the Orc, Willie, and Kamal at the Keystone Legend tier, as well as everyone else appearing on the end screen. Best of luck in your final days of the Mythic Plus season, gamers. See you all in Azeroth. Until next time, take care.